Me go first.
Oh.
Sorry.
Well, good way to start the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special Historians Lounge episode here on the channel. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. Joining me today is a returning guest to the show and also making her official debut in the Historians Lounge series. Now, my guest today is an historian, fellow content creator, an amazing human being. If you've been following her on Instagram and her YouTube channel, she is funny. Her character that she portrays is incredible with the little earpiece, which, if you have to see our previous episode to understand that little reference, you're going to absolutely love it. So, in this very, very special episode, me and my guest will be talking about something that we both have a huge interest in. And that interest is, of course, the legendary samurai. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about women in the samurai world. More specifically, probably the most famous woman in the samurai world. And to tell us all about that and her contributions to not just samurai culture, but Japanese culture and history altogether, let us bring ourselves to today's guest, fellow historian, content creator, and all around amazing human being, TK Nakamura. I hope I said your last name right. I had to go
You
back.
did. You did.
Okay.
Nakamura, yes, yes. I'm so happy to be here, Gabriel. It's always so fun to be on your show. You're so kind, so sweet, and you just have all of the nicest things to say, and I just love chatting with you. So I'm really excited to talk about one of my absolute all-time favorite people in history. I'm actually wearing her shirt
Ooh.
today. This is Tomoe Gozen.
Nice. And yes, listeners, that is who we'll be discussing today. Tomoe Gozen, who is, as I mentioned, arguably the most famous woman in samurai history, pardon, and Japanese culture in general. But to understand her, we also have to look at the samurai during Tome's period, which is a very interesting discussion because I'm sure you'll definitely agree, TK. The conception that we have of the samurai is mainly of the 15th and 16th century during the Sengoku period, the Warring
Mhm.
States.
Yeah.
But if you go back to the Heian period and even during the Muromachi period, the
Mhm.
samurai were not necessarily the same. They were not foot soldiers as we've seen them in media. They were equestrian based soldiers, which is really interesting. So, TK, sort of walk us through the world that Tomei existed in and what sort of brought her into fruition.
Yeah, so we have here the beginning or the ending of the Heian period and the beginning of the Genpai Wars. So I am just pulling out my timeline here really quick. Um about when the Genpei War started because I don't remember off the top of my head. So, yes, 1180 is when the Genpei War starts, and we have the beginnings of the Genpei War because of a succession dispute. So we have the Emperor Toba, who has lots of sons, but his initial, who everybody thought was going to be the successor was Emperor Sutoku. And Emperor Toba was a pretty shisty guy and asked his son, like, hey, can you actually like step down? Because I'm going to make somebody else the emperor, a 3-year old who is the fourth son of my like third concubine or something like that. And Emperor Sutoku was like, yes, fine, sure. I trust you, Dad. I'll step down. No big deal. So he steps down. And then Emperor Sutoku says, oh, actually, you know what? when I said I'm going to make your son the next ruler after my fourth son of my whatever concubine, isn't emperor anymore, I'm not going to actually do that. And then proceeds to die. So
Oh, brother.
Emperor Toba is dead. There is a succession dispute. Who's going to be the next emperor? Is it going to be Sutoku? Is it going to be this child who's now, I believe he was like 16 years old or something like that? Or is it going to be Emperor Sutoku's son? So a big pre-battle happens before the Genpai War, and then Emperor Sutoku is sent off to Shikoku, actually maybe an hour and a half away from where I live right now.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah, he's exiled, he's sent away, and then he dies a very, very sad death and becomes, one of the most deadly, scary ghosts in Japan. He becomes the Tengu Emperor, right? Yeah. So we have all of this internal struggle, all of this turmoil going on. So this is the world that Tomoe Gozen is born into. She, after so many hundred years of the Heian period being super peaceful, everything just kind of explodes and blows up. And that's how we have the Genpai War.
Interesting. Now, before
Yeah.
we talk more about Tomoe and her role during the period, I think it's also important to note when we think of the term, female samurai,
Yeah.
a lot of media, we tend to think of like, women in armor, going to battle. Not to say there aren't examples of that in history, but the term for samurai women, there was a specific class of them, and their duties had to go as follows. So, TK, can you talk us through that too?
Yeah. So one of the biggest misconceptions about samurai is that samurai means warrior, but it doesn't. So samurai is actually just a social class. So the social class of samurai. And within the social class of samurai, we have, some people who were more on the strategy side, like oh my goodness, what is his name? Oh, I forget. Mitsunari Ishida,
Yes.
who was more on the strategy side.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have people who, like Oda Nobunaga, who were, burning down temples all over the place. So
Yes.
we within the social class of samurai, we've got warriors and we've got non-combat people. And within the samurai itself, we've got four technically classifications of different warriors. We've got the Go-Kenin, who are the lowest of the low. They're the vassals of the feudal lords. Then we have the Goshi, which are like the rustic warriors. And they were not allowed to have swords, but they were allowed to have other weapons. And then we have the Hatamoto. So if anybody out there was just watched the new Shogun series, like I am currently obsessed with, the dude, the white guy, I forget his name.
Blackthorn.
Blackthorn, thank you. Yeah. He gets designated as a Hatamoto. So he is able to carry swords. He's like directly underneath the daimyo. And these are like the guys that are expected to fight and, if necessary, die for their lord. And then we have the women, and they're classified into offensive and defensive. So we have the Onabu Geisha, that are the defensive fighters, and then we have the Onamusha, which are the offensive fighters. So the Onabu Geisha are the women who are trained in naginata. They're trained in defensive tactics. If you also have watched Shogun, you'll see Mariko-san fight with a naginata.
Yes.
Sorry, spoiler alerts, I guess. um, so we don't really see enough of her to determine if she was an Ona Bugeisha or an Ona Musha. But yeah, that's what the Ona Bugeisha they were doing, because if you go off to fight and then your castle or your village is undefended, who cares if you win the battle if you don't have a home to come to?
Right.
you know? So a lot of times people think that these Ona Bugeisha were not as important or were less than the Hatamoto and the other warriors that were going out, but it's just not true because their role was just as important.
Hmm. And it's really interesting you bring that up because yeah, you're absolutely right. And I actually learned about them when I was doing my own research in
Yeah.
Japan more later in the Sengoku period.
Mhm.
But yeah, you're definitely right. Like these women that were more so trained to be the defensive, like the protectorates of the household and the castle,
Yeah.
it's huge. That's a huge responsibility because
Yeah.
they're in charge of not just the servant, they're in charge of their children,
Yep.
the other children of the concubines. They have to be the last line of defense. If someone
Mhm.
tried to sneak into the castle or to the village, as you said, to, cut the head of the snake while the main army's fighting in some distant battlefield,
Yeah.
then you won the battle, but you kind of lost the war because your family's already gone. And I'm actually
Exactly.
glad you brought that up. Like the weapons also important because we tend to associate the katana as being like
Mhm.
the quintessential samurai weapon. But the
Yeah.
katana really wasn't like the main weapon of the samurai class. That only
Mhm.
became later in like the 13th, 14th,
Yeah.
15th, 16th centuries. Like the main weapon, at least from the research that I found, was the
Mhm.
spear because most samurai during this
Yeah.
time period were equestrian based soldiers. They were trained
Yep.
how to use the yari spear, use the yumi bow, and their
Mhm.
armor is also interestingly different from the Sengoku period, from the box set that was very tight and constrictive, where it
Mhm.
had to adapt over time. So all of that is just really, really fascinating. So going back to Tomoe Gozen, what was her livelihood like? And pretty much what we're going to talk about later on or throughout the episode, but what about her made her like the quintessential, like this is like the hallmark of when we think of samurai women, it's
Mhm.
her.
Yeah, well, she is one of the only samurai women in I she might even be the only one in something called the Heiki Monogatari, which is like it's a chronicle of the events that led up to the Genpei War and then the Genpei War and then a little bit after the Genpei War. It's one of Japan's like major, historical. I like to use the word myth historical because
Mm.
it's both legend and history. So we do have to take the things written inside of it with a grain of salt. But I treat things in the Heiki Monogatari the way other scholars do. And if we accept what the male samurai are doing at the time, and then I'm gonna accept what the women samurai are doing at the time. And by women I mean Tomoe Gozen. So in the Heiki Monogatari, she is described thusly. Let me get my note here. Yeah. So she's described in a very, very cool way. So she had long black hair and a fair complexion, and her face was very lovely. And moreover, she was a fearless rider, whom neither the fiercest horse nor the roughest ground could dismay. And so dexterously did she handle sword and bow that she was a match for 1,000 warriors and fit to meet either god or devil. Yeah. This is how she's described.
Wow, that just reminds me of a little bit of Hua Mulan from the Mulan
Yes.
poem because
Mhm.
in for those who have seen the Disney movie, Hua Mulan is probably the most prolific character in Chinese mythology and folklore. She is
Mhm.
amazing, and the history behind the poem is equally fascinating. That was during
Yeah.
the early period in Chinese history, I believe, during the Han Dynasty, which I could be wrong. I
Mm.
haven't researched that in a long time, but her story is equally fascinating because she was probably like one of very few women warriors in Chinese history to lead. Now, to decide whether or not Hua Mulan or a person that inspired Hua Mulan existed, it's up to, interpretation. But still, the stories that have existed after her tell that she is this powerful woman, very, very beautiful, very, very elegant. And from what you've said, TK, Tomoe Gozen definitely exudes all of those traits. But I'm definitely going to ask this, which you brought this up earlier, where it's that during this period, it was like the rise of like the major powers, major legends, but also in legends, you have these tall tales that existed. So I'm sure Tomoe Gozen was no exception to these tales as well.
Yeah, yeah. So the unfortunate thing is that the names of women really weren't written down in Japanese history for the most part. Like um the woman who arguably wrote the first novel in history, Murasaki Shikibu, that's not her real name. The woman who wrote the Tales of Genji, like we don't know what her real name was.
Oh,
We just
really?
Yeah, we know her by her title and her position, and that's it. And the same thing goes for Tomoe Gozen. So we call her Tomoe Gozen, but that's not her name. We don't know what her name was. So Tomoe is actually Tomoe is a symbol, and I have it written down here. I'll send you a better picture of it so you can insert it. this this symbol here that I'm sure many people have seen, that's the Tomoe symbol. And Gozen is just a title. That's it. That's her title. That's her position. So we don't know what her name was. We just know her title and her position. And that is because she was the Ippo no Taisha, which means like first, like second in command. So we have Lord Kisano Yoshinaka, who was on the side of the Minamoto. So we have these two big clans, the Minamoto and the Taira, and they're on the Minamoto side. Right. And Lord Kisano, Lord Kisano made her his like second in command. It's like Lord Kisano, Tomoe Gozen. And so that's how she's written about in the Heiki Monogatari. But the thing that makes people speculate her existence is we don't know what happened. We don't know about her life before the Genpai War, and we don't know what happened to her after the Genpai War. So we don't have any information about her. The last piece of information that we have about Tomoe Gozen is when she dedicated maybe it was her, maybe it was someone that did it on her behalf, but she dedicated her naginata to a shrine that I actually visited last weekend. Yeah. So it's one of the oldest shrines in Japan, and it's on an island called Omishima, and the temple is called Oyama. Oyama. Oh my gosh, why am I forgetting it right now? Hold on, let me. Omishima Island Temple. I am forgetting it. Oyamazumi. Yeah, Oyamazumi is the name of this shrine. And so it's got a really cool history because the first emperor of Japan dedicated this island as a really holy place. And in the island, supposedly, is Japan's first god of war. Yeah. And so what samurai and Hatamoto and Onobugeshi and Onomusha would do is they would, after winning a battle, they would then go and dedicate their armor or their sword or their bow and arrow or something to that god of war. So they were used, which is really interesting because usually the armor or the weaponry that is dedicated to a god is only made for that purpose and it's not actually used in battle. So that's what makes this completely different. So we have documentation of Tomoe Gozen dedicating her naginata to this temple. That's really all we know.
Wow.
Yeah.
So pretty much we know that she existed during this period of the Genpai War. Like
Yeah.
we know that she existed, but we
Mm-hmm.
don't know what her name was before the Genpai War. We
Yep.
don't know what happened after. So it's kind of like those stories like the Knight Errant tales that we
Yeah.
have these lone characters that come into existence. They
Mm-hmm.
make an impression in a battlefield, a war, or a conflict, whatever, and then there are stories written about them, and then they just sort of fade away. So let's
Yeah.
actually focus on that right now. So let's actually look at Tomoe Gozen during the Genpei War. And
Yeah.
also, what was the Genpei War? Because I feel when we talk about wars in Japan, especially the medieval wars, again,
Mm-hmm.
most everyone think of are the Sengoku Wars of the 15th and 16th century. No one knows about the wars before that, like the Onin War, and
Yeah.
not a lot of people know about the Genpei War.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, there were the Genpei War goes between 1180 and 1185 CE. So, and it's also known as the Taira Minamoto War. So,
Mm,
basically what was happening is there were these two rival clans that had been like the runoff clans for the imperial family. So
oh, okay.
the emperors were just making far too many babies, just so many babies. And they were like, okay, we're going to have this huge succession war. So we need to basically separate the children that are born into these like different clans. This is a very like minimal information version. There's more that goes into it, but basically that's what happened. So we have the
Right.
Minamoto and the Taira. And then they are like they're each starting to accumulate more land. And they're like, "You know what? I don't really like the other clan." And then the Taira's like, "I don't really like the Minamoto." And they're like, "I want to be in charge." And then, "No, I want to be in charge." And so there's a bunch of different succession conflicts that are going on. So basically, it's like Japan's civil war.
I was going to say, because I've seen a little bit of House of Dragons, kind of like the war between the blacks and the greens, where two major families from one branch
Yep.
accumulating so much. And also, geography is also really important in the wars in Japan. So, where was actually, let me talk about that as a quick tangent. Where was the center of power during this time? Because I know that the center of power in Japan has shifted
Yeah.
drastically over the years.
Yeah, so the first capital in Japan was in Nara, and then it moved to um, Kyoto. And so during this time, the capital is in Kyoto. So
Mm.
basically, the Minamoto clan was the one that was like closest to the emperor. And so they're in the Kyoto, Hyogo, like Osaka area.
All
And
right.
then the Taira clan are in the Shikoku, Hiroshima, that area. So we're talking like southwest and then northeast.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So that's generally the areas. And then we have like one random like clan up in like close to Hokkaido, the Osha, I think it is, the
Okay.
Osha, Fujiwaras, and they don't come in until much later. We don't care about them right now. We just care about the Taira and the Minamoto clan.
All right. All right. So pretty much, yeah, literally the land is divided between these two major families. And as you
Hmm.
mentioned earlier, Tomoe Gozen is siding with one family.
Oh.
So from the research that you've gathered on Tomoe Gozen and her service, how does she sort of get drawn into the conflict? What is like the first indication that she's actively participating in the war.
Yeah, so we don't know if Tomoe Gozen was in a relationship with Lord Kisano, or if she was just like um, a vassal of his. We're not quite sure what the relationship was between the two of them, but because she was connected in some way to Lord Kisano and he was on the side of the Minamoto, that's how she gets dragged in, because he's a Hatamoto, he gets dragged in, he's got to go to war because the Minamoto are going to war, and that's how they get started. So her first battle is in 1183 at the Battle of Yokotagawara, and she comes in and just annihilates people. So during this time, yeah, just pardon my French, but she like fucks shit up hardcore. So during this time, headhunting was like the thing. So
oh yes.
yeah, if you wanted to rise in the ranks, you got to go chop some people's heads off. And can you guess how many heads this woman took in a single battle?
I'm gonna say between 50 and 100.
Oh my God, I wish. No, 7. She took 7.
Okay.
So when we talk about like taking heads, so you only want to take the heads of the elite. So, we don't know how many of the lower ranking samurai she killed, but she took 7 Hatamoto heads. Like, we're talking elite people just chopping heads off. It was crazy. And then
Gosh.
I know, it's wild. And then in the next battle is again in 1183 at the Battle of Tonamiyama, and she is in charge of 1,000 samurai. So she leads 1,000 samurai in this battle. And then the next one is in 1184 at the Battle of Uchide, Uchide no Hama, and she is only one of 5 survivors.
Holy mackerel. One of 5 survivors of that battle.
Yeah, on the Minamoto side. They get crushed. It's a bad time. It's a bad time. So during this battle, she's like, okay, well, I'm just gonna like die anyways. So I'm gonna ride my horse into a group of 30 Taira clan warriors. I'm gonna look for the biggest, meanest guy, and I'm gonna go chop his head off. And that's exactly what she does. She cuts off the head of this like strong man, this huge monster of a human being, Onda no Hachiro, and she literally twists his head off. And the only the only images of Mr. Onda that are left are paintings of him getting his head cut off by Tomoe Gozen.
Oh my gosh. And I would also imagine those are probably some of like one of very few artworks depicting Tomoe Gozen during this time.
Yeah, so actually we have quite a bit of art depicting Tomoe Gozen. We really don't have a lot of contemporary art of the time. We have a lot of art from not from the Genpai War, but about the Genpai War that happens at the very end of the Genpai War. So yeah, we've got 2 very famous images of her chopping some people's heads off. We've got this very famous image, which is one of the older ones of her riding a horse. Probably the one that most people know is an image that comes on a scroll. She's riding a horse. She's in her armor. She's got her swords. I'll send you these pictures afterwards, yeah, so that you can see them. But yeah, we have some, I wouldn't call them contemporary art, because we don't have a lot of contemporary art from the time, but yeah, they are right after. So kind of contemporary. Yeah.
Okay, so they would be considered in like the academic world like secondary sources after the war.
Exactly. Yes.
Ah, fascinating.
Mhm.
And then kind of leading into this before we go on to the next one. So I would imagine for a person like Tomoe Gozen or someone of her like power and stature getting all these kills, earning this reputation, I would imagine the other clans were probably considering getting rid of her because she's so much of a threat. So, from
Yeah.
your research, was there any indication that Tomoe's life was almost in danger by like assassination or anything like that?
No, there's nothing in the research that I've done that leads any like inkling of assassination or anything like that. Um yeah, she was pretty powerful, but like assassination was kind of like not a thing for her level of people. Does that make sense? Like
Mm.
she is a really incredible warrior, but they wouldn't have necessarily looked to assassination for her. That's more of like
Ah.
we're talking like the move makers are getting assassinated, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay. That
Yeah.
makes sense. So if
Mhm.
pretty much her enemies wanted her to die, they would have to kill her on the field of battle because they would literally earn acclaim and glory
Yep.
because they've killed a very, very prestigious warrior.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I would imagine after her death, stories are written about her.
Mm-hmm.
She is like this inspiration. And kind of on that, so over the years, I imagine the story of Tomoe Gozen has been passed down through generations and centuries and
Mm-hmm.
probably inspired other samurai women. And with that in mind, why do you think like she is this important figure, even though some academics would argue because we do not have a lot of contemporary research on her, we only know that she existed during the
Mm-hmm.
Genpai War, she may possibly be a mixture of multiple people as
Yeah.
opposed to just one individual.
Yeah. So, sorry, what was your question?
I was saying so. Tomoe goes since after her passing, she has solidified herself in the history books,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering how has like her legend been told and shared over the generations in Japanese history and Japanese culture, and more specifically for the women of, let's say, going back again to the Warring States
Mm-hmm.
period, because there were a lot of other
Yeah.
prominent women during the Warring States who were also female samurai who
Yeah.
were the commanders of their households who defended their homes, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they even fought men into battle. One example whose name escapes me, but she was the wife of a ruler in the southern regions of Japan who stopped the enemy advances on a bridge.
I know who you're talking about. I also forgot her name as well, but yes, yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really hard to say what kind of effect, you know, Tomoe Gozen would have had on her contemporary warrior women. Like, to us, it seems like a novelty. Like, she seems like a novelty.
Right.
But to the time, like to the other women of the time in the samurai class, I mean, I'm not sure. Obviously, she must have had some sort of impact on them because she's the
Right.
only one that makes it into the Heiki Monogatari, which is like a big deal. Her
Mm,
passage in the Heiki Monogatari is one of the most studied in Japanese literature. Like of the Heiki Monogatari, people study the chapter that she is in more than any other chapter because there are people who like I want to believe, and there are other people who are like, no, she actually didn't exist. So yeah, she must have had some impact on the women at the time, but I just don't know what extent that impact would have been at the time. But afterwards, she definitely made an impact on other samurai women. Like we've got Nakano Takiko, who talks about Tomoe Gozen, and who says that she was directly inspired. Nakano Takeko is more toward in the 1800s.
Yes,
So
yes.
yeah, like we just have so many other samurai women that I'm sure were definitely inspired by her. We just don't have a lot of information on them, which is unfortunate. We don't have their thoughts, we don't have their feelings, we don't have, their day to day. So,
Right.
yeah.
It's true, and it is unfortunate. And that brings up a very important thing in history, viewers and listeners, is for topics like these, they aren't recorded. Even with learning all of the incredible stuff that TK has shared with us, we just don't have enough, or I should say, at the very least, no one
Mhm.
took the time or the care to really document who Tomoe Gozen was, where she was born, who was her family. We knew that she was of the elite class, but we don't know full much. Or not even after, did she get married? Did she have any children? Are there any
Yeah.
descendants of her? We just don't know. And she sort of falls into that realm of mythical characters and mythical figures, which is altogether too prominent in history, but they do play a role, which is inspiring the next generation.
Yeah.
Now, TK, this is actually going
Mhm.
to be a little different question because
Mhm.
from our last interaction a few months ago, I understand that you have been working on a book of Tomoe Gozen to try to not only tell the history of Tomoe Gozen, but try to give her agency, try to give her a voice.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that really quick. So, what drove you to begin writing this book and gathering all the research, and what do you hope to accomplish at the very end when you have it finished?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. So the book that I am in this is actually the notebook that I do my research and planning that I've been referring to throughout this episode. But um, I'm writing about samurai women in general because if you Google samurai, books about samurai, or books about samurai women, if you get specific, one shows up. And any other books on samurai are, you know, I would say 80% of the book is about the men, and
Yes.
maybe 10 to 15% of the book is about women. I was inspired after I checked out the illustrated book of samurai from my
Mm.
library, and I was going through and going through and going through, and there were 4 pages in this 100 and whatever page book about samurai. There are 4 pages about women. And I was like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I could fill a book of all of the different samurai women: Tomoe Gozen, Nakano Takeko, Nagasawa Umetaro. I there's so many other women. There's so many other mythological women too, like
Mhm.
Tsuruhime, and there's samurai power couples as well who,
Yes.
they were married couple, and they would go out and they would battle, and it would be, freaking crazy and super super cool. So to me, there's just not there's not enough information about these women out there, and there is enough information to fill a book. There is several books, I
Right.
believe. That's my intention with this. And I want to also demystify samurai, because there's this air of, you know, mystery, which is great. I think that's fun. That's definitely fun.
Mhm.
But I think the history gets lost in that often.
Right.
And I want to make the history of samurai, not only women, but samurai in general, more clear and less, I don't even know how to describe it. Like, less overhyped. Like samurai are really, really cool, but I feel like the focus of the coolness is on things that are conflated and not
Right.
the actual things that are cool. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
Yes, I 100% agree. Like we have seen like so many movies about, okay, case in point, the demystifying the katana being
Mm,
like the primary weapon of the samurai. It was a weapon, but it wasn't the weapon. A lot of
no.
samurai were trained in multiple weapons. Like you have
Yeah.
the kanabo, you have the tetsubo, you have the
Mm-hmm.
bow, you have the kusurigama, you
Yeah.
have a bunch of other swords, which are
Mm-hmm.
not even the katana. You even have the nodachi, you have the odachi, you
Yeah.
have the wakazashi, you
Mm-hmm.
have the tanto. You have so many. And then, of course, if you want to even blow people's minds, you have the very rare, but the I forgot the actual name, but it's the original Japanese swords, which, yes, viewers and listeners, the katana wasn't the original sword design in Japanese history. That came about later through trial and error
Yeah.
because traditional, or I don't want to say traditional, but early samurai
Mm-hmm.
swords were straight with a
Yeah.
single edge, and they were heavily based off of the swords from the continent. And by the continent, I mean Joseon and China, more specifically Ming China, if we're going the Sengoku period.
Yeah.
So it's very, very interesting, and everything that TK is saying about demystifying the samurai, and also the haircuts, which has been like instrumental in like our interpretation of samurai. Yes, the haircuts, which the little top knot and the
Yeah, the
shaved head.
chomage. The chomage.
Yeah, some samurai had that, but not all samurai were like that. They had like regular head of hair with a little top knot or
Ponytail.
a little bow in the back, or maybe
Yeah.
none at all. So it's really
Yeah.
important to demystify that, which I definitely think brings a lot more clarity to it. And for me, as a classical historian, it's the same thing as Rome. We have this notion that Rome is this impressive empire with a whole bunch of other things.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is true. And even the depictions of Roman soldiers has been the same over time. We
Yeah.
have the same armor from like the imperial age to the Western age. Not necessarily true. The armor has changed because of the time, just like the samurai armor.
Mm-hmm.
The samurai during the Heian period, they wore a suit of armor that was very constrictive. You had the big shoulder pads,
Yeah.
which were designed to block arrows that were trying to shoot at them. It was
Yeah.
only the armor that we see in The Last Samurai, and that was from the Sengoku period, where it's a little bit
Mm-hmm.
more movable. You can
Yeah.
actually fight. It's easier to put on. It's not restrictive. All of that is important because it kind of makes the samurai or any other culture very stale. It's very
Yeah.
stagnant. It doesn't change. So I'm really excited that you're working on this, TK, and doing a huge service to Japanese history as well
Thank
as
you.
samurai, because I'm sure you definitely agree. Samurai have been immortalized in pop culture, which
Oh yeah.
also brings up another important discussion, which I'm sure you definitely have a lot of comments on. So, even in Western movies and Japanese movies, there are so many incredible films about famous figures in Japanese history,
Mm-hmm.
from Miyamoto Musashi and the Book of Five Rings,
Yeah.
Oda Nobunaga, Zaitochi,
Mm-hmm.
fictional samurai, but
Yeah.
an impressive figure nonetheless, but not a lot of dedication or even a movie attempt on Tomoe Gozen or any other famous figure in Japanese history. And I'll give another
Yes.
case. There was a movie, Ichi, a blind female swordsman who was
Mm-hmm.
literally trained by Zaitochi. That's the only movie I can think of where it's like a female lead, but an
Yeah.
historical female lead, there's none. So why do you think that is, TK, in your opinion, with all the information that we have of Tomoe Gozen, the stories about her, what
Mm-hmm.
she did? I mean, literally tearing off someone's head with their bare hands.
So
Is that
cool.
real? It is cool. Realistic? Incredible. Absolutely. So
Uh-huh.
why do you think there hasn't been a movie or even a series dedicated to Tomoe Gozen or any other famous woman in Japanese history?
Misogyny, to be honest. Like, I think so much of, because the samurai are war history.
Yes.
They fall under war history. But I would I joke with about this with my friend all the time. The samurai are the drag queens of warriors. Like, they are the drag queens of warriors. They wrote poetry. They were very into their fancy armor, and they're like, you know, really beautiful paintings all over their armor. You get up close and personal with some samurai armor, that is beautiful. It's
There it
gorgeous.
is.
Yes, and they were into their tea ceremony. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had a golden transportable tea room, and that he would sit and have his little tea in almost on the daily. Like, that man loved tea and flower arranging. Oda Nobunaga, he dressed up in women's clothing all the time. He loved to do the women's fan dance. Like, the idea that people have of samurai is this hyper masculine image, and that's just not true. That's not what it is. But that's what, it started when Matthew Perry came on his black ships,
Yeah.
and all the historians that were on, not the historians, all the contemporary people that were there, they saw this one particular image of what the samurai were, and then they held on to it and ran with it. They didn't go deeper into what the not even deeper, just like look like to the left a little, like look to the side. Like, this is also what samurai are. And I think that's why the initial contact with samurai was this, outwardly very hyper masculine. And then people ran with it. People took a very small part of samurai history and culture and ran with it. And now I think it's intimidating as a woman to start getting into Japanese history, because you do have people who are really mean online and in my classes too. When I was studying Japanese history, you know, because I wasn't super into the Sengoku period, or because I didn't have a deep knowledge already of like the Five Rings book, I was kind of excluded in a way. And I think because the audience to who consumes this samurai content is primarily men, that's why we don't have a series yet about women, about Tomoe Gozen, about Nakano Takiko, any of that, because people want to make money.
And also, just to add on to that, like going to you say like demystifying the samurai, you could
Mhm.
even make the same argument to the shinobi, because we
Yeah.
have this notion of the shinobi in like all black with the hood, even though historically shinobi didn't wear all black. It was
Mm-mm.
not accurate. A dark blue is probably
Mhm.
more accurate, as well as most shinobi were samurai. They were of the samurai class, like Hanzo Hattori, probably the most famous shinobi, was a samurai. He was arguably known as the demon because of his reputation and the
Mhm.
shinobi that he trained. And the weapons too, like the shurikens, the
Mhm.
kunai, and also to break a lot of fans who love the Naruto anime, they didn't have the ninjato. That was not an historical weapon. If they did have a sword, it was most likely a wakizashi,
No.
a katana, or a dagger of some kind. They
Yeah.
didn't have those. And everything about that, again, what you're saying is entirely true. And I think tying back to Shogun,
Mhm.
what you brought up, I think Shogun is definitely a good step in the right direction of telling accurate
Yeah.
Japanese history. Yes, it's
Mm-hmm.
still based on the book
Yeah.
that was also adapted in the 1960s or 80s with
Mm-hmm.
starring Richard Chamberlain.
Yeah.
But while that one, of course, some would argue followed the more classical tropes of the time, this one is a little bit more closer and actually gives the agency to Japan. In fact, Japan was front and center. You didn't have the Catholic Church at the forefront in the original. It was primarily what you were talking about in the beginning, TK, the succession. Who would inherit the throne and
Yeah.
who would rule the land? So all of that is very, very fascinating and enticing. And then, of course, what you said, this fascination was like the violence around the samurai, the mysticism around it. We're seeing
Mm-hmm.
that again in Assassin's Creed Shadow, where we play as a female shinobi, but also a historical figure, Yasuke, which I'm very excited to see.
Yeah.
So before we end this wonderful episode, with everything that you've learned, TK, about this history and working on your own book to try to bring not just authenticity but clarity to this topic, what do you hope to inspire to other people who may want to learn more about Tomoe Gozen and the other women of the Heian period, Sengoku period, Muromachi period during the Ashikaga shogunate, and even women who existed at the later half of the Tokugawa era who
Mm-hmm.
fought against the Meiji forces?
Mm-hmm. To the people who would like to know more about women's history in Japan, I would say you're gonna have to dig a little bit. You're gonna have to go, maybe on the second or third page of the Google search, to be able to find stuff. But there is things out there. There's so much women's history in Japan out there. Like, you know firefighter samurai women who were in charge of the women's quarters at Osaka Castle, who would dress in these red gorgeous uniforms. And Japan is famous for having a lot of fires, so they were
Mm-hmm.
in charge of sounding the alarms, getting the women and children out of the women's quarters. There are so many women out there. You just have to look. You just have to dig a little bit harder, and don't get discouraged if you come across some not super nice people in your quest for knowledge about samurai women. Yeah, I would just say just keep going, keep looking, because they are out there.
Awesome. Awesome, TK. And this concludes this amazing episode here on the Historians Lounge. I want to give a huge thank you to TK for coming back on the show and telling us all about Tomoe Gozen and her future project on Tomoe Gozen and the other women samurai during the Han period and possibly later. So I'm really excited for that. And thank you all very much for the love and support on the channel. 102 subscribers is incredible. Thank you all so very much. I really appreciate it. And I know you've all been asking. Michael is almost finished. It's almost done. The final edits will be taken care of. And the announcement of the pre-order and the ARC applications will be up soon. So you just have to wait. But until then, thank you all very much for joining us today. A huge thank you to TK for coming back. And before I forget, TK, are there
Yes.
any announcements you would like to make right now? Any upcoming episodes you would like to showcase? Any events?
Yeah. So I have I do believe it is July. At the end of July, I think I will be having actually a online lecture about samurai women, for people to attend virtually. I do believe it is on the what day? The 29th for me, which is a Monday, and the 28th for everybody else who is not in Japan. So I'll be doing that. There will be announcements coming about that on my Instagram. And then yeah, that's what I've got going on. And my season starts. I don't know when this episode is going to release, but my season starts on July 12th. So I'm really excited about that. And if you want to get your own Tomoe Gozen shirt, you can go to my merch store.
I will link TK's channel at the bottom of the description of this video, as well as tag our interview together so you can all check her out. And I urge all my followers to do. TK is an incredible person. She is witty. She is funny, super sweet. And honestly, her character persona that she portrays on Instagram is honestly probably one of the many highlights of my day. I love seeing her character. I love seeing her have that little earpiece, which again, if you want to know the reason behind that, you have to watch the episode because I don't want to spoil it. It's actually a real interesting story. So again, my viewers and listeners, thank you all very much for joining us today on our discussion of the samurai. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I've definitely enjoyed it. And I will see you all very soon in the last few episodes of my June lineup before we go into July. And I'm very excited to showcase July because I have some very interesting first-time authors who will be making their debut on the channel. So definitely look at my newsletter coming out in the coming days. So until next time, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below what was your favorite part of the episode and what did you like the most about Tomoe Gozen and her story. And until next time, have a wonderful day, as this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out.